Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Charles Lee, whose PhD thesis I advised in the CE department. He completed his PhD in environmental engineering at Princeton in 2018, following an undergraduate degree from Peking University in atmospheric science. His research here was at the intersection of air pollution and the efficiency of solar generation of electricity from PV panels. His work culminated in two major papers, one in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science and the other in Nature Sustainability. In the first, he used satellite data and a PV performance model to evaluate the reduction in the amount of sunlight reaching the PV panels due to aerosol pollution in the atmosphere. He found that over highly polluted eastern China, reductions could be as high as 35% due just to atmospheric aerosols alone. In the second paper, he conducted a global analysis, expanding on the earlier work, that included both the effect of aerosols in the atmosphere and deposited as dirt on the solar panels. He found that with no cleaning and precipitation-only removal, PV generation in heavily polluted and desert regions is reduced by more than 50% by aerosols, with dirt on the panels accounting for more than 2/3 of the reduction, indicating the importance of cleaning PV panels in such polluted regions. His work highlighted the win-win opportunities of PV electricity generation and air quality improvements. Clean up the air, you get more solar electricity generation. More solar generation means less combustion of polluting fossil fuels and cleaner air. Following his graduation, Charles wanted to use his training in the real world and immediately joined the energy and environmental economics firm in San Francisco. His work focuses now on analyzing and modeling long-term greenhouse gas mitigation strategies at the US state level. Since joining E3 in 2018, Charles has been promoted twice and is now a senior consultant leading technical analyses on recent building electrification studies in California and New York, as well as recent decarbonization studies in Maryland and Nova Scotia. He believes that developing clean, low-carbon energy is imperative if the world is to shift towards a sustainable development path. He joined E3 to work at the forefront of the electricity transformation, and because of E3's reputation for delivering well-rounded and unbiased analyses, a bit like what we do in academia. So I'm delighted to have him back and look forward to his talk on state-level decarbonization efforts. Good to see you, Charles. Welcome back to Princeton virtually.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Denise, for this generous and comprehensive introduction. Let me pull up my slide really quick before I go on. Just want to make sure, like, let me see, presentation mode. Denise, can you see my screen? Okay.
We're good, Charles.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone. And thanks, Denise, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be back at Princeton, although virtually this time. When I signed up for this seminar, I was hoping I could be back in Princeton in person, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of opportunities in the future after the pandemic. And I'd be really happy to meet a lot of you in person, talk about my work then. It's really an honor to be back here. Remember, like, I was a regular attendee of the seminar back during the days when I was in Princeton. And a lot of these talks, great talks, like really inspired me to work in the energy space. And I really appreciate Denise for inviting me back today, and also appreciate Kiwi and Chuck for all the arrangement to make this happen through a virtual environment. So I'd like to start my talk today with a little bit kind of self-introduction of how I got into the energy space. I was born and raised in Shanghai during like most of the fastest rapid growth period in China. And I would never kind of thought that I would work in the energy space if I went back like 20 years. But just looking back at my childhood time, it was really a time that witnessed a lot of the energy transformation in China. I still remember like when I was like 5 years old, we didn't really have gas connections in our home. So my dad would just ride his bicycle basically and bring back a full tank of liquefied petroleum gas, LPG tank, and to connect to our gas stoves, and then just to cook and also provide all this hot water needs for the family. And when I was about 8 in the late 90s, we moved to this new apartment and we finally had gas connections. We had a tankless water heater, we had gas stoves, all the gas is on demand. It was still coal gas. And it was in the early 2000s that everybody got really excited that China built this massive infrastructure to bring natural gas from the western part of the country to the eastern part, and was thought of as like a much cleaner and safe fuel to use compared to the coal gas. It was really a time that, you know, a lot has changed. And we also kind of installed our first AC during that time. And initially, we are really kind of careful about using electricity because it was considered expensive and luxurious to use AC. And we had a lot of kind of rolling blackouts during that time. A lot had happened over the past 1 or 2 decades. And back then, like making sure people has access to energy was a top priority, but now making energy cleaner becomes a new priority. And then I left home and went to Beijing. I did my undergrad at Princeton University. I was majoring in physics first, but then I got my interest into atmospheric science. One of the major reasons I switched to atmospheric science was because during that period of time, I personally witnessed the bad air quality in Beijing. And back then, there wasn't a lot of public data on air quality, and the general public wasn't even aware of air pollution. A lot of people thought it was fog. And I got kind of really into atmospheric science because I think it is like more kind of applicable work that can potentially help us solve the problem of air pollution in China. And I did my senior thesis on long-range transport of air pollution to Western China. And after college, I got this opportunity to come to Princeton and work with Denise for my PhD work. Initially, I was very excited about atmospheric physics, specifically looking at climate impacts of atmospheric aerosols. And throughout the years at Princeton, you know, I attended various classes on energy and energy economics. I also listened to a lot of the talks and seminar by the STEP program, as well as by PEI, the Princeton Energy Institute, the Carbon Mitigation Initiatives, and later the Allinger Center. That all kind of inspired me, get me realize that, you know, energy is really kind of is the kind of one of the key puzzles to solve, and if we were to tackle the air pollution problems as well as climate change. And I developed my thesis, as Denise introduced, looking at how atmospheric aerosols affect solar power generation efficiencies globally, and look at 2 different effects. The effect of aerosols in the air blocking sunlight from the solar panels, and the other effect of, you know, aerosols depositing on the top of the solar panels, creating this soiling effect. This is a plug really for our recently published paper based on my PhD work, and, you know, I'm happy to answer any questions if you are interested. And then after Princeton, I really want to apply and transfer the knowledge and skills I developed during my PhD to the real world and make impact in the industry. And that led me to my current job at E3. So a brief introduction about E3. As the name indicates, E3 is a boutique consulting firm that specifically solve problems for energy and environmental economics. The company started about 30 years ago. Start with our boss, Dr. Ran Oren's paper looking at the value of distributed energy resources in deferring transmission and distribution investment. And then we started in this practice area of DER, as we call it. And now we have 5 core practice areas. We're still doing job in the distributed energy resource space, and we're now supporting rate design as well as distribution system planning. The other kind of core practice area that we work on is climate pathways and electrification. This is also my focus at E3. We build, you know, economy-wide pathways models and do comprehensive and long-term greenhouse gas analysis to help states and regions to design pathways to achieve deep decarbonizations in the various sectors. And the other kind of core area at E3 is resource planning. And we've built a portfolio of models to kind of inform longer-term system planning and forecasting, mainly for the utilities. The key questions we answer is that, you know, in a high renewable and decarbonizing future, how utilities should plan their resource procurement, and how can they ensure providing reliable services to customers at the same time. And then further down the stream, we also have a lot of asset evaluation and market analysis work, where we have models to simulate wholesale energy markets in the future and also provide key insights to inform system operators, market participants, and investors. So E3, when I joined E3, was only like a 40 to 50 person team. And now within the past 2.5 years, we have doubled our size and we have more than 100 person now. And we are doing more than 200 projects actually a year across the energy sectors in all 5 core practice areas. I would say this is still like a rapidly developing and expanding field. There's a lot of opportunities there. So this is my plug here for E3. We're actively recruiting. So if you are interested in our work and interested in doing an internship or full-time, please feel free to contact me after this. And E3 all gets started in California for the first 20 years. Excuse me. And, California has, taking a leadership role in the US in developing renewable energy and climate policies. Back in 2002, California passed a Senate Bill 1078, which was among the first in the US to set up a statutory requirement for renewable portfolio standard. California back then set up a 20% renewable portfolio standard, so-called RPS, by 2017. And only 4 years after that, California updated this target to be 20% by 2010, 7 years ahead. And throughout the years, California has been setting up, various RPS targets for 2020 and 2030. And it was about 3 years ago in 2018 where the California State Legislature passed the Senate Bill 100, basically we call it SB 100, which requires a 60% RPS target by 2030, as well as 100% clean electricity by 2045. In addition to the renewable energy policies, California has been also leading in the nations in set up economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction target. Back in 2005, California's, the then governor, Schwarzenegger, actually issued an executive order required the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 80% below 1990s level by 2050. And just 1 year after that, the state legislature actually put a statutory requirement for the states to go back to its 1990 level of GHG emissions by 2020, an effective 15% reduction relative to a reference case. In 2016, California passed a law requiring 40% reduction by 2030. And it was 3 years ago, Governor Brown actually signed an executive order that is among the first in the nations to require the state to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And in addition to all these requirements and laws and executive orders that look at economy-wide GHG emissions, California also started to target at specific sectors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In 2016, California is among the first to pass a law specifically target at short-lived climate pollutants and non-CO2 emissions. It requires to reduce methane and hydrofluorocarbon emissions by 40% by 2030, and also anthropogenic black carbon emissions by 50%. And in 2018, the state legislature passed a law that required the state agencies to assess the potential to reduce building emissions by 40% by 2030. And just a few months ago, last year, Governor Newsom signed an executive order that required 100% in-state sales of light-duty vehicles to be zero emissions by 2035, and then 100% sales of medium heavy-duty trucks to be zero emission by 2045. So basically, after 2035, no carbon-emitting light-duty vehicles will be allowed to be sold in California. So when the state legislature and also the governor make the policies, it is up to the California state agencies to implement those policies. And there are three major state agencies that are involved in renewable and climate policy implementation. First is the Energy Commission in California, and then the Public Utilities Commission, and also the California Air Resources Board. The California Energy Commission, the CEC, is the state's overarching energy policy and planning agency that's responsible traditionally for making energy efficiency standards, such as building codes, as well as the state appliance codes. It is also in charge of making sure renewable energy procurement among the utilities will meet the state's RPS goals. And as the overarching energy policy and planning agency, the CEC also issued a lot of research grant to look at, how the state can meet its long-term decarbonization goals, as well as the various thorny issues that the state will face. The CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, is the agency responsible for regulation of utility, especially investor-owned electric and gas utilities. Its job is to oversee the rate making of the utilities and also ensure that service are reliable to the customers. The 2015 Senate Bill 32 also required the CPUC every 2 years to conduct and coordinate a state-level integrated resource planning, basically making sure that the utilities are procuring resources so that they all meet the RPS goals, as well as reduce carbon emissions from a generation that is consistent with the statewide GHG target, and also make sure that services will be reliable. The California Air Resources Board, or CARB, is the lead air quality and greenhouse gas emission regulator. It's responsible for making the state's climate change scoping plans every few years. It also implements most of the state's climate programs, including the cap and trade program. And here at E3, we have been supporting the agencies throughout the years on works. With the CEC, most recently, we actually worked with them in a research grant looking at deep decarbonization in a high renewables future. And more recently, just last year, we released a report with the CEC looking at the challenge of retail gas in California's low carbon future. With the CPUC, our work dates back to 2009, when we were kind of assessing the implementation of 33% RPS, even before it became the law. And then more recently, we have been supporting the CPUC on its integrated resource planning throughout the years. And the most recent version, we're basically helping them to look at how the utilities can meet the 60% RPS goal by 2030. With the California Air Resources Board, we supported them in 2017 on the climate change scoping plan to achieve the 2030 GHG target of the state. And then just a few months ago, we also released a new report with the CARB looking at how the state can achieve carbon neutrality. And that's going to turn into a new scoping plan that's going to be carried out and coordinated by CARB. It's not only in California, but over the past few years, there's been a lot of really encouraging progress across the US. Across the US, states, cities, and utilities are pledging to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a map that I got from the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions that tracks state-level greenhouse gas emissions target. These are all the states that currently have statewide long-term GHG emission target, either through executive orders or through statutory required by law. And all these yellow stars are indicating that I found those states with a carbon neutrality by mid-century target. It is not only happening on the state level, but on the local level, 250 mayors have set carbon reduction targets. And the 5 biggest electric utilities in the US are now committed to zero carbon electricity generation by 2050, including New Jersey's utility PSEG. And there's been also a lot of really high profile and really high quality reports recently being released looking at the nation level, how US can reach deep decarbonization. I just want to mention these 2 really good reports that I saw recently. One is the Princeton Net Zero American study, and the other one is the National Academy study looking at accelerating decarbonization in the US. And here at E3, we've been working more on the state level. And as the states are considering and setting up targets, we are also expanding our climate pathways work into the various states and regions. We started in California and New York, but now we have set up more than a dozen pathways models for the various states and regions. And one work I want to specifically spend some time on introducing to you is the Maryland Pathways work, which we have been working with the Maryland Department of Environment over the past 4 years. And just recently, Maryland released, about 2 weeks ago, I think, on February the 19th, Maryland just released their state climate plan and kind of detailed out how the state planned to meet its 2030 climate target. So before I kind of jump to talk about Maryland, I want to pause here and I want to see if the audience have any clarification questions. Denise, are you seeing any questions from the audience?
Not at the moment, so I think you're
okay.
good.
Great. Okay, I'll continue. I'll pause another time after I talk about Maryland. So Maryland set up its economy-wide greenhouse gas emission reduction target back in 2009, where the state legislature passed the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Act, or called GGRA. And the GGRA requires the state to reduce its economy-wide emissions by 25% below the 2006 levels by 2020. And then in 2016, the governor reauthorizes the GGRA to further extend this target to 2030 and require the state to achieve 40% emission reductions by 2030. And then currently, there's a bill being considered by the state assembly that will make this target even beyond 40% reduction. It is considering 60% reduction by 2030, as well as a carbon neutral target by 2045. And then in terms of renewable energy policies, back in 2004, Maryland set up its first RPS target through a law that requires a 9.5% by 2018 RPS requirement. And just 2 years ago in 2019, another law was passed that requires Maryland to achieve 50% RPS by 2030. And currently there's a bill in the Maryland state legislature that's supported by the governor to further extend this target to 2040 and for the state to achieve 100% clean and renewable electricity. And as I mentioned, we have been supporting the Maryland Department of Environment, which is charged by the state's legislation to develop the state's climate plan. And the climate plan is specifically focused on how Maryland can achieve its 2030 target beyond the current policies. This is required by the law, but the plan also look at in the long term, what is the effect of those efforts in achieving more kind of emission reductions by 2050. What is really interesting about this whole process is that Maryland has been really successful engaging state agencies and also a kind of very versatile group of key stakeholders, so-called mitigation working group, in the whole process of making the climate plan. And we have been, as a consultant, like actually talking to the state agencies as well as the stakeholder groups various times to get their feedback and input on the climate plan that we were making with the State Department of Environment. Just looking at, historical greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland, how that compared to Maryland's 2030 target. Maryland's most recent state level greenhouse gas emission inventory shows that back in 2017, Maryland has already achieved its 2020 target, which is more than 25% emission reductions below 2006 levels. But there's still additional effort needed actually to meet its 2030 target. And just looking at Maryland's current emissions, GHG emissions by sector, roughly a third of the emissions are from transportation, another third from electricity generation, and the remaining third from a combination of building, industry, as well as non-combustion emissions. So over the years, we have built and designed multiple scenarios for Maryland. We first started with a current policy scenario, or we call it the reference scenario, which indicated by this gray line. And then back in 2019, we also designed a 2019 GGRA draft plan And the purpose is for the stakeholders and state agencies to weigh in and provide feedback based on that draft plan. And then just 2 weeks ago, Maryland released its final plan, the 2030 GGRA plan, that details out how the states is going to make its 2030 target. What's worth noticing here is that the final plan actually achieves way beyond what the GGRA law requires. It almost achieved a 50% reduction by 2030. And our scenario is showing that Maryland can do that, is able to do that. And also another consultant on the project who runs economic impact also shows that this is going to bring positive job impact through 2030 and beyond. But our scenario is also showing that the state needs additional effort beyond existing policies to achieve its 2030 GGRA target. And those policies should really target at two of the largest emitting sectors, the transportation sector and the electricity sector, for the state to meet 2030 target and also achieve beyond that. The other thing I want to note here is that because the 2030 GGRA plan mostly focuses on 2030, it doesn't really meet any 80% or net zero aspiration goals in Maryland. But there's still a gap there that the state requires additional measures actually to kind of push the state even further to reach deep decarbonization by mid-century. What we find for Maryland is that Maryland needs sustained actions across the four major pillars to reach decarbonization goals. And the four pillars include: first, energy efficiency and conservation; second, electrification; low carbon electricity; and also reduce non-combustion emissions. The state of Maryland already has a lot of very good energy efficiency programs, including its Empower energy efficiency program that require the utilities to carry out efficiency programs with customers to reduce their electricity use. But what we found here is that Maryland needs even more effort beyond their current programs. They need to have more stringent codes and standards. They need to encourage people to switch to efficient devices. And they also need to kind of encourage people to retrofit their building shells to improve their energy efficiency, as well as with other behavioral conservation and smart growth measures to further bring down their primary energy efficiency, the MMBTU of energy consumption required per person, per capita. Another very key pillar to decarbonization is electrification. Maryland really needs to convert their state fleet to mainly based on electric vehicles, and well as turning their heating systems from the fossil-based system to heat pumps, to electrify their vehicles and electrify their space and water. And that should be companioned by also the cleaner electricity generation from both in-state and from import. Maryland is already on track to meet its 50% RPS goal by 2030. And it's also pledging to kind of further reduce emissions from its electricity generation fleet beyond 2030. And the other kind of color I want to add here is that Maryland is such a small state that roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of its electricity consumption actually comes from import from the PJM. So for Maryland to really kind of achieve zero carbon electricity, Maryland in the long term need to actually work with all these neighboring states and also the PJM states to really kind of achieve on a regional level lower electricity generation. And last is to reduce non-combustion emissions. Maryland will target reducing methane emissions from natural gas transmission distribution system, and also reduce the hydrofluorocarbon gases as well. In addition to that, they're also looking at measures to increase carbon sequestration on natural and working lands, especially through better forest and healthy soil management. As the state is finalizing their climate plan, they also realize they need to have more targeted efforts at specific sectors. So this year, the Maryland Department of Environment is required to develop an energy transition plan to decarbonize the state's building stocks. And they hired us actually in the next year or so to support them with technical analysis to look at potential pathways to decarbonize buildings. And in my next few slides, where I'm going to talk about E3's experience working on building decarbonization in other jurisdictions. But before I do that, I want to pause again to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Actually, this time there is. Professor Bob Cohen has a question. And Bob, I think it might be best if you go ahead and ask it rather than having me read it.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Professor Cohen. Yep.
This was a great presentation, Charles. Thank you so much. My question is this. California and Maryland have emphasized renewable portfolio standards and other product standards and have de-emphasized carbon prices. California has a carbon price, but doesn't do most of the work. And yet in the academic literature, in the economics literature at least, carbon prices are the panacea that is seen by economists. They aren't followed in practice very much. And do you have a comment on why what we see in the economics literature in theory is not what actually happens in practice?
Yeah, thanks, Professor Cohen. That's a great question. Actually, this is just my personal opinion and also based on the various work at E3. What we find is that, carbon pricing is one of the key measures to actually help facilitate decarbonization. But what we found is that we also need a portfolio of policies. In addition to carbon pricing, other incentives, business and policy innovations, utility programs, as well as educational campaign to drive the needed market transformation to reduce costs and also achieve decarbonization. I think carbon pricing works really great with sectors that are more kind of cost sensitive, such as commercial and industrial sectors. But carbon pricing may not work that well for residential customers and consumers who make decisions beyond just economic interest, and they have other kind of non-economic concerns and preferences. Let me give you an example. One of the key hurdles that we're seeing, for example, with building electrification or building decarbonization, is that consumers are not aware of, for example, the heat pump technologies. And just thinking about, when a consumer kind of have their current gas furnaces, kind of fails and they want a really immediate replacement of the gas furnace with another new devices, it is usually the contractors that, approach those consumers and tell them, okay, here are the things that's available. And, usually contractors are more kind of adept with installing a like-for-like replacement instead of a heat pumps. And in that kind of a situation, consumers are not super aware of what technologies are out there. And the contractors don't really have incentives to kind of install a new, more efficient electric devices for them. And what it really needs, I think, is, policies from the state as well as from the utilities to kind of, make the consumers be aware of those technologies, as well as provide incentives for those contractors actually to be willing to, install and spend time learning about installing new systems. So not to make this more complicated, but my personal opinion is that carbon pricing works, but also we need, a portfolio of complemental policies in order to make the decarbonization happen, especially a lot of the consumer-faced strategies and to kind of push forward consumer adoptions. And does that answer your question, Professor Cohen?
Yes, it's a terrific answer. And we can talk more about the politics of it, but it's certainly a large part of the answer you gave.
So I suggest you go on now and we'll take additional questions at the end.
Yep, sounds good. All right, I'm gonna kind of switch the gear and talk about building decarbonizations. When we think about strategies to decarbonize buildings, there are a lot of options there. On the one bookend, can think about electrification. Basically, switching all these consumers from using their current gas or furnaces and boilers to using electric heat pumps and supply all this heat through electricity. On the other bookend, consumers can remain using their gas furnaces and boilers, but then utilities need to blend renewable natural gas into the pipelines in order to reduce carbon intensity of the gas to achieve decarbonization. The problem with using renewable natural gas as well as low carbon fuel is that a lot of those would depend on sustainable biomass feedstock that have limited availabilities and sometimes are really kind of expensive to produce for the consumers. What we found across our economy-wide decarbonization studies is that the vast uses for biofuels and renewable natural gases include for those really tough to electrify sectors such as trucking, industry, aviation, and off-road transportation. There are also some challenges with electrification. Building electrification a lot of times depend on consumer preferences, economics, as well as research and development to create appropriate technology from all building types and application. And sometimes driving consumer adoption of those new technologies actually requires really helpful policy designs. In California, California work back in 2018, we found that, compared to other options, building electrification in the state offers a cheaper and also lower risk option to reduce carbon emissions in buildings compared with other measures. We found that it is much cheaper to install heat pumps in California's home, comparing supply those homes using existing infrastructures with biofuels and also other renewable natural gas. What we also found in California is that consumers now can save money by switching to heat pumps, majority of the consumers. What we found is that there are existing opportunities for people in retrofit single-family homes as well as people in new constructions to immediately save money and generate life cycle savings to switch from gas furnaces to electric heat pump systems. In addition, electrifying a residential building in California can also immediately reduce carbon emissions. In the long term, it can reduce 80 to 90% of carbon emissions if the grid and the refrigerants become cleaner. This analysis that we put together in 2018 already account for natural gas leakage as well as refrigerant leakage from AC equipment. But there are also challenges with building electrification. The case study I just showed was in California, but in colder climate regions, there's potential impact on the electric grid that needs to be addressed. Electricity demand from heat pumps are tied to the outdoor temperatures. Electric demands increase dramatically as temperature drops. This is a chart that's showing the performance of a cold climate air source heat pump in a climate in Chicago. A cold climate air source heat pump is one that operates much more efficiently compared to regular air source heat pumps during low temperature. But this is showing that even below a certain cold temperature threshold, like below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, electric heat pump is going to draw much higher load to provide increasing heating demand as temperature gets colder. And also its compressor capacity is not enough, so it has to use electric resistance backup heat, which is of much lower efficiency to provide heating need. This lower chart here is showing the challenge with building electrification in colder climate. This case look at in New York and New England, what is the total building thermal loads compared to the electric system load. The total building thermal load is as if all of the buildings in New York and New England are going to supply their space and water heating just using electric resistance heat. This is like more like a thought experiment. You can imagine that using heat pump is going to be more efficient than this most of the times. But during the coldest hours, heat pump might not be that much more efficient than electric resistance heating. So you're still seeing that with building electrification, you would expect a winter electric load increase double or even triple, quadruple the current peak load in summer in those systems. Those systems will become winter peaking as they electrify building heat. And the potential solution to that is to use backup heat or hybrid system, where customers can still rely on heat pumps to provide the majority of the heating need, but only during the coldest hours when the heat pump is not that efficient and when the heating demand is high, they can supplement heat pump with an existing or old gas furnace to provide heat need. And that, accompanied by grid management solutions, can potentially mitigate the impact of building electrification on grid that requires less capacity planning. Another challenge that building electrification brings is the impact on gas distribution system and rates, especially in California, where we found that building electrification is really like the lower cost and lower risk solution. This can bring challenges to maintaining the gas system and can potentially cause hikes in gas rates. The gas rate actually includes two different components. One is the delivery part of the rate. Basically, it is the capital investment that the utility makes to kind of set up all the gas distribution system and also to maintain and replace them. In an electrification future, the throughput of the gas system will fall. And then the system costs, if not grow, will still kind of remain high because utilities still need to maintain their system. And they still have those investments from 10 or 20 years ago they need to recoup from the customers. And then in such a future, the dollar per MMBTU average delivery rate will increase in order for the utility to kind of recoup those costs back and meet their system revenue requirement. The other part of the gas rate is commodity rate. Basically, in a low carbon future, utility needs to start blending zero carbon fuels into the pipeline in order to reduce emissions. And the dollar per MMBTU commodity rate that it will charge to customers will increase due to the relatively high cost of biogas as well as hydrogen blending in the pipeline. And this is likely going to start a vicious cycle for the gas utilities. You have all these aging infrastructure and rising gas commodity costs that's going to increase the rate higher. At the same time, there's lower cost renewables and increasing electric demand and better heat pumps to make building electrification economic, especially in mild climate like California. And further climate policies further push down gas demand. And then in order for the utilities to recoup back those fixed cost investment, they need to allocate those to fewer customers and then further cause the gas rate to increase. This is what we so-called the death spiral of gas utilities. There are potential solutions for that problem. One of the solutions that we propose in our 2020 report is to have a geographic targeting of electrification. Basically, you can turn off gas services for blocks and electrify them all at once, so the utility doesn't really need to replace or maintain those systems. That can help retire gas system capital and reduce gas system costs and also alleviate impacts on gas rates. You can imagine that in a future without a gas transition strategy and under a high building electrification, the customers who remain on the gas grid will face really high gas rates and also a huge increase in their gas bills. This chart is showing you a comparison under a high building electrification future, a gas bill of a typical mixed fuel home in California compared to those people who already switched to all electric homes. And those people who remain on the gas grid are usually those who are unable to switch away from gas, including like renters who face the typical market failure of landlord and tenant conundrum, and those low-income customers who cannot really afford the high capital costs required to switch to electric equipment. And as part of the transition plan, those customers should be offered tools to support their transition. And one pilot solution that utilities are considering is on-bill financing. On-bill financing is this idea that instead of letting the consumers pay the upfront cost of the new efficient electric equipment, utilities can own those equipment and then charge a subscription fee to the customers. So in the customer's monthly bill, they will be charged, the energy consumption as well as that extra subscription fee. So if the electric efficient system really pans out compared to a gas system, ideally, the customers will basically see their monthly electric and gas bill decrease more than offset that subscription fee that utility charge. And then GAC can solve the conundrum of the landlord-tenant issue and also lower the barriers for low-income customers in this transition. This is actually my last slide for today. When I talked about Maryland, I talked about the 4 pillars, but really to achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century, based on most recent report that we find, as well as consistent with the 2 other national level studies, it requires a portfolio of existing and reach technologies. The state and also the nation need to have ambitious near-term actions on energy efficiency, electrification, zero carbon electricity, and reduce non-energy emissions, but also needs to spend a lot of scale up the research and development effort into looking at how to produce zero carbon fuels on a massive scale, as well as one of the other important pillars, which is to look into the option of applying carbon dioxide removal strategies, such as land-based carbon sequestration and direct air capture of CO2, another very key pillar to bring the entire economy net zero. There are going to be, in each of these pillars, there are going to be a lot of work ahead of us. And I'm really excited about all these new R&D that's going on in the research community, all this new investment that's going to be brought into the private sector to support this massive infrastructure transition, as well as a lot of very key important deployment efforts to make sure there's going to be a just and equitable transition. And I think this is only going to be a starting point for us. And I really look forward to kind of how these will turn out, and also bring all these knowledge, experience to other parts of the world, especially developing countries, for the world together to tackle the climate crisis. And this is a note I want to end with today. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Let me start my video again here. The first question on the list here is from someone I think who's interested in E3 and is your interest in recruiting people is resonating. He wants to know, how can they contact you?
Oh yeah, sure. So here's my email, charles.lee@e3.com. Feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to set up a call with you to talk about E3.
Super, thanks. Also, someone was asked about whether the recording of your talk is uploaded to YouTube or a website. We have it on the C-PREE Center for Policy Research on Energy and Environment website, where you can find not only Charles Lee's talk, but also all of the other talks that have been given, in fact, for the last few years. And Keely Swan has just uploaded that link to the Q&A list. There's a few questions I might try and just merge and ask you, Charles, and then a few that we might have people ask directly. One question was, is there any specific recommendation on the percentage of wind, solar, nuclear power for Maryland and other clients? And is there any plan where CO2 is removed from the atmosphere?
That's a good question. Yes, actually, in terms of the electricity sector, Maryland, when it set up its RPS requirement, as well as this new law called CARES, basically Clean and Renewable Electricity bill that's considered by the state legislature, they specifically actually call out carve-outs for solar and offshore wind build in Maryland. I don't remember the exact number, but I think Maryland is set to achieve like maybe 14% of its generation from solar, as well as roughly maybe 8 or 10% from offshore wind in the state by 2030, and even more aggressive target for the long term. And Maryland has a nuclear plant called Calvert Cliff, which its license is going to expire by 2036. in all these scenarios, we are looking at Maryland relicensing the nuclear plant. Basically, it's going to supply about 25% of its energy in the long term. So those are all considered. But in terms of carbon removal technologies, this is not considered in this study because this study focused more on the short term, 2030, instead of the long term. But I'm sure, like as Maryland set up, more aggressive target in the future, they will need another study to consider what technology it takes to reach carbon neutral. And carbon CCS, carbon removal technology, is definitely going to be on the table.
Interesting, thanks. Professor Rob Sokolow has a couple of questions. Rob, do you want to go ahead and ask yourself?
So am I audible?
You are?
Yeah, Professor Sokolow, yeah, I can hear you.
Hi. So Charles, you're making much of heat pumps, which indeed have to do a lot of heavy lifting. You said that they were already cost-effective replacements for gas furnaces. Was that in California? It was a surprising result. I guess it would depend a little bit on whether the gas furnace was needing to be replaced anyhow, rather than something that's running perfectly well. And also, would you say something about ground-based heat pumps? If you walk around this campus when you finally get here, the university is making an enormous investment in ground-based heat pumps at this time.
Thanks, Professor Sokolow, for your question. Yeah, I want to add a clarification question here about this finding from California. I wasn't being too clear. So what we found in California is that it's cost-effective to replace a gas furnace plus AC system with heat pumps. And what we consider was basically an end-of-lifetime replacement. Basically, the consumer was comparing an option of purchasing a new gas furnace plus an AC and weigh that against installing a heat pump. And what we found there is that, yes, it is cost-effective. But in terms of early retirement, I think it requires more analysis to see whether that can pencil out or not. And what we also found is that if you look at this pie chart on the high left, there's 16% of people that's going to see a lifetime cost increase is exactly those people that do not need AC in a lot of coastal regions in California. But we found that those people still need to pay higher cost to install a heat pump if they're just comparing it with installing a gas furnace alone. So that answers your first question. I think the second question is on ground source heat pump. Yes, I think we have been actually considering and modeling ground source heat pumps for the various different regions. And I think certainly one of the biggest advantage of ground source heat pump is that the ground temperature is relatively stable across the years. So it wouldn't have this kind of effect of air source heat pumps that losing its efficiency dramatically at low temperature. It can potentially be a great solution in very cold climate regions to actually mitigate the peak impact from heat pumps. So I think it is a great option, but I haven't personally looked into the economics of ground source heat pump and compared to other solutions. So I can't really speak to that. But in terms of managing and mitigating impact on grid, I think it would be a great technology to employ.
Okay, thanks. David McCabe has a related question regarding electrification of heating. Do you want to go ahead, David?
Sure. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Charles. Very interesting material. I was wondering what you were thinking about the potential role of green hydrogen or blue hydrogen in residential or commercial heating. Just given the huge hill to climb for really cold climates, I think also considering the enormous amount of beefing up of the grid that would be required.
Right.
And ideally beefing up the grid with not just the grid, but the generation base with zero carbon that would be, available in those extremely cold situations.
Right.
It's very daunting. I want to say, since I've got the floor for a second, that, I think your hybrid approach is very wise. But that also raises questions about what happens to, for example, the methane leak rate in a system that isn't used very much.
Right.
But anyways, but to So you put a lot of good stuff on the table. I'm just wondering what you think about hydrogen.
Yeah, thanks, David. This is a great question. Actually, I think hydrogen and also renewable natural gas is going to be playing a critical role in a hybrid future. And I agree that, the hybrid scenario is probably going to be the pathway for a lot of the cold climate regions to decarbonize their building end uses. I think there are a lot of questions. I don't have like a clear answer to that. For example, one of the challenges with using hydrogen is that the current gas infrastructure cannot directly support use of a high blend of hydrogen. You need to really kind of make investment to revamp those gas pipelines to accommodate hydrogen, and that also costs extra money. And the other problem is with, if you were to kind of produce hydrogen on a massive scale, and you also need to think about, smart ways of doing that as well. So overall, I think it's gonna play a very important role overall in a hybrid future that I can see. But still, there are a lot of remaining problems to solve, basically, for that.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from Ben Prater on electric infrastructure. Ben, do you want to go ahead? Well, I can ask the question for him. As Maryland continues to create more electric infrastructure for wind and solar, are there any concerns regarding the land footprint of the wind or solar equipment?
Yeah. Yes. So as part of our study, actually, Maryland Department of Environment also conducted like a rough estimate of land surface requirement to put the additional solar and wind. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but generally their finding is that there will be sufficient land in Maryland to accommodate those solar and wind build in the long term.
Okay, good. I guess I'll ask the very last question for now before we close, which is, I think it's extremely inspirational what you've shown. There's been a transformation in the last few years at the state level with various states making larger and larger commitments to decarbonize. And I'm wondering if you have any insight from the work at E3 as to whether this is really taking off in additional states beyond the ones you showed us in your early figure. And if there's anticipation that states will go beyond what the Biden administration is hoping to push out, or if they're going to be highly supportive or resistant, or if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Denise. So yes, I'm only showing the work that is public that we do. We are doing also a lot of confidential work with various utilities and clients. And the short answer is yes, we are doing work in much more than the states with current long-term GHG targets. And what we find is that, especially for electric utilities, they have the incentive actually to be more engaged in this policymaking process and put forward target even ahead of the state government would do. One example here I want to show is the Excel Energy, basically. We did this project with Excel Energy back in 2018, where we supported their zero carbon electricity generation scenario and study. That was before Excel officially announced that net zero target in 2019. And they really kind of get ahead of the state of Minnesota and also Wisconsin in their service territory to announce those goals and kind of push forward agenda for cleaner electricity. So I definitely see there are a lot of interest in the industry is to kind of get ahead of the government and then to put forward actions there.
Well, that's great news. I think we're maybe reaching a turning point on greenhouse gas emissions, and that's very exciting. Thank you so much for sharing your work and E3's work with us. I'm going to close the official part of the recorded part of the seminar now, but I invite people who would like to ask Charles some additional questions to stick around like we would if we were actually in a real seminar room for a few minutes. His next scheduled meeting is at 1:30, so he'll have to leave just a couple of minutes before that. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you all for joining. Thanks so much, Denise.